September 13th, 1918, Brookline, Massachusetts. A baby's head is crowning, partially visible, pressing out into the world, and the doctor hasn't arrived. The delivery nurse looks at Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, looks at the emerging skull, and makes a decision. She places her hands on the infant's head and pushes it back into the birth canal. Then she holds it there. Minutes pass. Then more minutes. The doctor still hasn't come. She keeps holding. For 2 hours, while a physician makes his unhurried way to the Kennedy home, a nurse physically prevents a baby from being born. Modern obstetric science complicates what happened next. A fetus in the birth canal still receives oxygenated blood through the umbilical cord and placenta. The baby doesn't breathe independently until after full delivery. But prolonged second-stage labor carries its own dangers: cord compression, cranial pressure, cumulative physiological stress compounding with every passing minute. The medical professionals who later evaluated the infant attributed her intellectual disability to the circumstances of that delivery. Precise causation can't be confirmed at a distance of more than a century. What can be confirmed is that a nurse held a baby in the dark for 2 hours, and the girl who emerged was damaged. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy. The family called her Rosemary. 23 years later, in November 1941, Rosemary lay on an operating table at George Washington University. Her head had been shaved. She'd been given a mild tranquilizer, enough to calm her, nowhere near enough to put her under. She was fully conscious, fully awake, able to see the room and hear the surgeons and feel the incisions being made near the front of her skull. Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James W. Watts inserted a leucotome, a blunt blade designed to sever neural connections, into the white matter of her prefrontal lobes. They told her to recite the Lord's Prayer. She did. They told her to sing "God Bless America." She did. They told her to count backward. She did. With each instruction, they cut deeper, using the disintegration of her own voice as a map. Every slurred consonant told them how far they'd gone. Every lost word told them how much of her mind they'd already destroyed. She kept speaking until the words became fragments. Fragments became sounds, and sounds became nothing. Rosemary Kennedy went silent on that operating table, and she never came back. The woman they wheeled out had the approximate mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She couldn't walk. She couldn't control her bladder. Her speech, when it eventually returned in broken form, was largely unintelligible. The attending nurse, whose name, like the birth nurses, has been lost to history, walked out of that operating room and quit medicine entirely. She never practiced again. She imposed on herself the only consequence anyone in this chain would ever face. Every person who participated in the destruction of Rosemary Kennedy was guilty, and not one of them was punished. What follows is the evidence. Before the lobotomy, Rosemary Kennedy was a functioning young woman. That fact matters because everything that came after depends on understanding what was stolen. Her IQ placed her in the range of low normal to mildly intellectually disabled. She was slower than her siblings, late to crawl, late to walk, late to speak. But her surviving diary entries reveal someone who could record daily experiences in written sentences, noting outings and social events with genuine engagement. She danced at family gatherings. She participated in Kennedy's social life, haltingly but recognizably. The gap between Rosemary and her brothers and sisters was real and measurable. It was also survivable. Countless families have accommodated that gap without resorting to brain surgery. What changed was the collision between Rosemary's emerging adulthood and her father's political machinery. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, biographers document a period of increasing behavioral volatility, mood swings, episodes of agitation, and reports that alarmed Joe Kennedy Sr. more than anything else. Rosemary had been sneaking out at night. Whispered concerns about her sexual vulnerability circulated through the family in the coded language of the era. Joe Jr. was being groomed for Congress. Jack would follow. The Kennedy brand demanded total control, and Rosemary's behavior was the one variable Joe Sr. couldn't manage through money, influence, or intimidation. She was 23 years old. She was unpredictable. And to her father, she was a liability. Joe Kennedy Sr. didn't agonize over this. He went looking for a solution and found Walter Freeman. Freeman occupied a strange position in American medicine in 1941. A neurologist at George Washington University, he'd partnered with neurosurgeon James Watts to perform prefrontal lobotomies on a growing roster of patients. Freeman was the evangelist, the public face, a crusader who promised families that their unmanageable relatives could be made docile and cooperative through a brief surgical intervention. His enthusiasm outpaced his evidence by a wide margin. In the spring and summer of 1941, the American Medical Association had issued explicit warnings that the lobotomy procedure was too experimental and its side effects too severe and unpredictable for broad application. Joe Kennedy either never read those warnings or overrode them. He authorized the lobotomy on his 23-year-old daughter without telling his wife, without consulting any of Rosemary's siblings, without seeking a second opinion from physicians outside Freeman's circle. Rose Kennedy later claimed she had been entirely unaware the procedure was happening, that her husband arranged brain surgery on their eldest daughter behind her back. Historians have debated that claim for decades. Joe was unquestionably the kind of man who made unilateral decisions about everything from finances to infidelity, and Rose operated within a domestic structure that punished questioning the patriarch. But Rose was also a meticulous manager of her household and her children's lives, a woman who oversaw educational placements and social schedules with obsessive precision. A 23-year-old daughter doesn't vanish from family life quietly. Whether Rose genuinely didn't know, or whether she adopted ignorance as self-protection, the outcome was identical. She raised no objection before the procedure and offered no intervention after. Now place two facts side by side, because separated they are damning, and together they are something else entirely. Joe Kennedy Sr. made the unilateral decision to lobotomize his daughter, overriding the AMA's explicit warnings, without informing a single member of his family. Then he sent Rosemary to a series of institutions: Craig House in Beacon, New York, then a facility affiliated with George Washington University, and finally, St. Coletta, a Catholic institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin, and he never visited her. From November 1941 until his death on November 18, 1969, a span of 28 years, Joe Kennedy Sr. didn't once travel to see the daughter whose brain he had authorized strangers to destroy. He suffered a massive stroke in December 1961 that left him paralyzed and largely unable to speak for his final 8 years. That still leaves a clean 20 years, 1941 to 1961, during which he was fully capable of getting in a car, driving to Wisconsin, and looking at what he had done. He chose, on each of those 7,300 days, to stay away. He watched one son become a congressman, a senator, and then president. He watched another become attorney general. He orchestrated campaigns, managed fortunes, conducted affairs, traveled the world. Through all of it, his eldest daughter sat in an institutional room in rural Wisconsin, unable to speak her own name, and her father never walked through the door. Joe Kennedy Sr. died at the compound in Hyannisport. He was eulogized as a patriarch and dynasty builder. Rosemary wasn't mentioned. Freeman and Watts, the men who held the blade, fared even better. James Watts eventually distanced himself from Freeman over the transorbital technique. continued his distinguished career in neurosurgery at George Washington University, and retired with his reputation fully intact. Walter Freeman performed approximately 3,000 additional lobotomies after destroying Rosemary Kennedy's brain. He developed the transorbital technique, driving a modified ice pick through the patient's eye socket into the frontal lobes, and traveled the country in a van he called the lobotomobile, performing assembly line brain surgery in state hospitals. His procedure had been recognized internationally. Antonio Egas Moniz, the Portuguese neurologist who developed the original lobotomy technique that Freeman adapted, received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949. Freeman lost his hospital privileges in 1967 when a patient named Helen Mortensen died during her third procedure at his hands. But that single revocation, 26 years after the Kennedy lobotomy, was the only formal professional consequence he ever received. He died in 1972. The AMA had warned against the procedure before he performed it, and the medical establishment absorbed its own failure without consequence. And then there is Rose. Most accounts of Rosemary's story either minimize Rose Kennedy's role or misframe it entirely, presenting her as a grieving mother trapped by her husband's tyranny, a fellow victim of patriarchal cruelty who deserves sympathy rather than scrutiny. The documented facts don't support that framing. Rose Kennedy didn't visit her lobotomized, institutionalized daughter for approximately 20 years. Biographers have reconstructed the timeline. Rose's last contact with Rosemary came around the time of the lobotomy or shortly after, and her first visit to St. Coletta didn't occur until the early 1960s, coinciding with Joe Sr.'s incapacitating stroke in December 1961, which stripped him of his role as the family's gatekeeper. 20 years. The math deserves examination. The Kennedys had private aircraft, personal drivers, limitless financial resources. Wisconsin is a domestic flight from Massachusetts, a day's drive at worst. No physician counseled against maternal visits to a woman in custodial care. Even if Rose genuinely didn't know about the lobotomy in advance, she knew afterward that her daughter had been institutionalized and was never coming home. She knew where St. Coletta was. She knew the address. And for 20 years, through the birth of grandchildren, through her son's inauguration as president, through the accumulation of the very wealth and influence that could have funded the finest private care in the world, Rose Kennedy stayed away. Logistics didn't prevent the visit. Distance didn't prevent it. Medical advice didn't prevent it. What prevented it was a decision, renewed every single day for 2 decades, to leave her eldest daughter alone in a facility staffed by strangers while she occupied her position in Hyannisport, in Palm Beach, in the warmth of her family's public glory. In her later years, Rose did resume visits. She maintained some contact through the 1970s and 1980s and into the early 1990s. She lived until January 22, 1995, reaching the age of 104, and was publicly celebrated throughout those final decades as the indomitable matriarch of America's most famous family. A woman who endured the assassination of 2 sons with stoic grace. Her obituaries praised her resilience. None of them led with the 20 years she spent choosing not to see her daughter. The family's erasure of Rosemary extended beyond Joe and Rose. Beginning around 1944, the Kennedys systematically removed Rosemary from personal correspondence. She disappeared from family photographs, from holiday letters, from the curated Kennedy gatherings that doubled as political theater. When outsiders asked about her, an inevitable question given the family's size and visibility, the Kennedys deployed a rotating cover story. She was reclusive. She preferred a quiet life. During JFK's 1958 Senate re-election campaign, the family actively maintained that Rosemary simply chose not to participate in family life. In the pre-internet era, the lie held. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, Rosemary's closest sibling in childhood, later stated she had no idea where her own sister was for approximately 20 years, that she only learned Rosemary's location after Joe Sr.'s stroke stripped him of the ability to enforce his information embargo. If true, this reveals the depth of one man's autocratic control over his own family. He could disappear a daughter and prevent even her closest sibling from finding out. If false, if Eunice knew and stayed away, then the complicity extends further than two parents. Both interpretations are devastating. Neither has been resolved. When Eunice published her 1962 article in the Saturday Evening Post, the first public acknowledgement by any Kennedy of intellectual disability in the family, the cover-up had held for more than 20 years. The article was groundbreaking. It was also, viewed from a certain angle, an exercise in narrative control, telling the story on her own terms, ensuring the family would frame Rosemary's tragedy as a springboard for advocacy, rather than a crime that demanded accountability. Maureen Callahan's book, Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed, raises additional allegations about what Rosemary may have suffered, including claims of sexual abuse within the Kennedy family. These remain allegations that some historians now reference, but that haven't been independently verified, and this script won't build its case on unproven ground. Rosemary Kennedy lived at St. Coletta for the rest of her life. She died on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86. 64 years in institutional care. Her condition never substantially improved. The neural connections that Freeman and Watts severed in November 1941, the ones that had housed her ability to write diary entries, to dance, to sing, to form sentences, to know her own name, those connections never grew back. They couldn't. That's what severing means. 64 years, longer than most people's entire lives. She outlived the father who authorized the surgery by 36 years. She outlived the mother who didn't visit for 20 by 10. She outlived the doctor who probed her skull by 33. And across every one of those years, through every administration her brothers served in, and every headline the Kennedy name generated, Rosemary sat in Jefferson, Wisconsin, in a room most of the world didn't know existed, paying the permanent cost of a decision the historical record can't confirm she was ever consulted about, let alone consented to. The question this story leaves behind isn't complicated. A delivery nurse held a baby in a birth canal for 2 hours and was never disciplined. A father authorized brain surgery on his adult daughter without telling anyone and never visited her again. 2 surgeons probed a conscious woman's skull until she went silent, and one of them continued performing the same procedure thousands more times. A mother chose not to see her institutionalized child for 2 decades and was celebrated as a national icon until her death at 104. A family erased a living woman from its records, its photographs, and its public identity for a generation. Who paid for any of it? Rosemary did. Only Rosemary. For 64 years. Eunice Kennedy Shriver eventually founded the Special Olympics, one sentence in a legacy that deserved volumes. Subscribe for more stories like this.